Hello and welcome to a brand new Dynasty on NCAA 14 with the help of College Football Revamped. The first thing you may notice is that I'm using Florida State for this Dynasty. Unlike most series on YouTube, I don't have an interest in the typical formula of taking a new or poorly rated team and building them up to be a national powerhouse. That's not because that isn't an interesting storyline, it's because that kind of series has been played out in every possible way. By picking Florida State, we are immediately taking over a team that has aspirations of competing for a spot in the college football playoff. We aren't going to be taking the slow road with some moral victories if we have tough losses along the way against a highly rated team. We're going to have the trajectory of our season change, even with one loss potentially. Those kind of stakes are going to make our games matter from game one. And speaking of the college football playoff, this series is going to feature the playoff in the 4-team variety. The reasoning behind that is I want to emphasize that a playoff berth should feel like a huge accomplishment, and the more teams you make into the playoff kind of tarnishes that. Your next question may be, how are you going to pick those 4 playoff teams? Here's the beauty of it. There isn't going to be a need to compare resumes and have to make a judgment call of who deserves that last spot. That decision is going to be made on the field. I've done some realignment of conferences. In our new structure, there are 4 super conferences: the SEC, Big 10, Big 12, and Pac-12. If you win the conference championship game from one of those conferences, then you are earning a bid to the playoff. It's that easy. The other wrinkle I did throw in is that the conference championship games are no longer at neutral sites. They are going to be hosted by the team with the best record, so it almost creates another round of playoffs and rewards the best teams with an extra home game. And speaking of conferences, let's get into exactly what kind of changes I made to the conference structure. The first conference we're going to take a look at is the brand new SEC, which has 4 4-team pods. And the teams that are in your pods are the teams that you are going to play every year regardless of how the schedule works out. As Florida State, we're going to play Florida, Miami, and UCF every year. Georgia, Georgia Tech, Clemson, and South Carolina are going to play each other every year. Alabama, Auburn, Ole Miss, and Mississippi State going to do the same, and as well for LSU, Tennessee, UNC, and NC State. And now what we're going to go through is how that these divisions are going to be configured from season to season. The first one we're going to go through is what season 1 looks like. So as Florida State, the teams that are above the line with us and on that same line are going to be the teams that we are going to play on our schedule and are going to be the teams that we are competing with for one of the division titles. So that'll be Florida, Miami, UCF, Georgia, Georgia Tech, Clemson, and South Carolina. And then the teams from pods 3 and 4 from the last screen: Tennessee, Alabama, Ole Miss, LSU, Auburn, Mississippi State, NC State, and UNC are going to make up the other division, and then the 2 division winners are going to play in the conference championship game. And the other thing that you're going to be able to see on the screens are that the team that you are across from, so the team, in this case for Florida State, LSU, is the team that I'm going to set as their protected rival to just add another confirmed game and help to keep some of those rivalries alive that this format isn't going to be able to in other circumstances. So we have Auburn and Georgia here, and Florida and Tennessee, but also let for some new games rise to the top, like Miami and Alabama. Then for season 2, it rotates to where now the teams from pod 1 have the teams from pod 3 in their division on the same line. So as Florida State, we still have our usual pod 1 games with Florida, Miami, and UCF, but now we get, in season 2, Alabama, Auburn, Mississippi State, and Ole Miss. And then the other side of the division is going to be made up of LSU, UNC, Georgia Tech, Clemson, Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, and NC State. And you can still see that we have some of these protected rivals in place, so the Florida and LSU game is going to be alive and well. We get some ACC action of Miami and North Carolina, and we also keep our Florida State and Clemson game, which is pretty important at this point that that's been one of the bigger rivalries and probably the biggest one in the ACC, at least, over the last 10 to 15 years. And then we'll move to season 3, where our teams from pod 1 are going to add in Tennessee, North Carolina, NC State, and LSU, and that will make up a division. And then the other division would be Georgia, Georgia Tech, Mississippi State, Auburn, Alabama, South Carolina, Clemson, and Ole Miss. And I know this seems kind of convoluted and can be a little bit tricky, but we'll go through what the season we're on and how that rotation is going to flip going into the next year, who the new divisional partners are going to be, and how that's going to look. But I think that this is going to end up being for the best because it does ensure that we will see every team in our 16-team conference at least once every 3 years, and then there's other teams we're going to play every year, and some teams that we're going to see 2 out of 3 years. So like your protected rivals, we have a different one each season, so Auburn, Clemson, and LSU, we'll see 2 out of 3 years, which I think makes for a really compelling schedule and makes for something where you'll want to tune into every game because they're going to matter and there aren't going to be those cupcakes from lowly conferences. That these are going to be some big-time schedules that we're going to be looking at from season to season. And our next super conference is going to be the brand new look Big Ten, which I honestly love this structure and kind of the way that it shaked out. And, there had to be some tough choices of teams that didn't make it, and we'll see where they ended up in some other conferences. But I want you to keep in mind that there is this new look for these conferences, but these aren't permanent. I'm going to be taking a look at how teams are doing in the other conferences and seeing if anybody deserves that move up to a bigger conference. So if your favorite team isn't in one of the super conferences and doesn't have a chance at a national title right now, hold tight. There's probably going to be some other opportunities for your team to make it there if they do well, and we'll see how those things go. And at the end of the day, I want the best teams competing for the national title, so there is no agenda against anybody here. It's just trying to make sure the best teams are in the best conferences and we're putting together the best games. But with that being said, let's take a look at what this conference structure looks like for the Big Ten now. Ohio State, they get Kentucky, Cincinnati, and Louisville in their pod. Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa in a pod. Then you have Michigan, Michigan State, Purdue, and Indiana in a pod. And then our final pod is going to be Notre Dame, Penn State, Pittsburgh, and West Virginia in a pod. And I think these are pretty balanced divisions where it still has those heavyweights that should probably do well at the very beginning, but I think leaves plenty of room for some other teams to rise up and make some waves. And this is what the Big Ten structure is going to look like for season 1. I don't need to go through all the semantics like I did for the SEC. I'm sure you see the formatting now, but it gives you a chance at some of the matchups that we're going to see right away. And there's obviously some traditional ones like Ohio State and Michigan. And then there's some former ACC matchups with Louisville and Pittsburgh. And then some really just downright weird ones like Kentucky and West Virginia. So I feel like the Big Ten is going to be competitive and breed some good football, but also be pretty darn weird from the very beginning. And then in season 2, this is what the format will look like. This is the season for what we'll see Ohio State and Michigan get to be in the same division, and it's going to give an opportunity for a team like Penn State or Notre Dame probably to make a move in this year to help themselves get to a Big Ten title game. And again, also some very weird matchups that we'll have to keep our eyes on. Then finally, this will be the Season 3 alignment. We'll get the Ohio State-Michigan game. That's going to be protected every year in some form or fashion, whether they're in the same division or just as a protected rival. And still get some pretty good Big Ten games that feel Big Ten-y in my mind of Michigan State and Penn State. But again, there is some downright weirdness with this group. Pittsburgh and Iowa is never going to feel real, but maybe this series is going to turn Pittsburgh into a true stalwart Big Ten team where that game is going to feel more conference-y. But that was kind of the point of this conference realignment, was to shake things up and try to give this Dynasty a different feel where it doesn't seem like the same thing that you even see on Saturdays. The next new super conference we'll look at is the Big 12. And the pod structure here felt pretty natural for me. So in pod 1 we have Texas, Texas Tech, Texas A&M, and Arkansas. A lot of bad blood there. That makes a lot of sense. Then in pod 2 you have Baylor, TCU, Houston, and SMU. Some of the biggest markets where you have the Dallas area and the Houston area represented here, and could create some really fun games. Then in pod 3 you have Oklahoma and Oklahoma State keeping their rivalry. Iowa State and Tulane are a little bit of the oddballs of the group, but I think throwing them into a pod where they have to prove themselves against Oklahoma, who obviously has a ton of history, and then Oklahoma State, barring last year, has been a pretty consistent Big 12 program, and they'll have to get their footing pretty quick there. And then in pod 4, you get the 2 Kansas schools in Kansas and Kansas State, and then bringing back Nebraska and Missouri, where I think this is the group of chaos, where anything could really happen in pod 4 from season to season, and I think that's what's going to make it great. And then in Season 1 for the Big 12, we'll have this group, and I treated Texas and Oklahoma similar to Ohio State and Michigan, where they're going to play each other every year, whether they're in the same division or whether their rivalry needs to be protected, so all you Red River Shootout fans, have no fear. And as I just mentioned, this would be that season where Texas and Oklahoma are going to be in the same division together, and you still have the Arkansas and Texas A&M of it all. That this seems like it's going to be a bloodbath of a season on that side of the division. And then the other side of the division, I don't know if it's going to be good football, but I do know that it's probably going to be very entertaining. You still have the two top teams from the Big 12 last season in Kansas State and TCU there, and that's going to be a big story that I'm going to be following. Is TCU a national contender, or are they going to kind of come back more down to earth and they're going to be a sometimes Big 12 contender? And that finally brings us to their Season 3 rotation, and I'm sure everybody can kind of see how these work, but you're probably taking a look at those protected rivalries, seeing where some of your favorite Big 12 schools are lined up, and I gotta say, I'm really, really excited to see what Missouri and SMU looks like. That will not be good football, but I bet it will be a shootout. And that brings us to our final super conference, the Pac-12, and here's how they're going to line up. Pod 1 has USC, UCLA, Fresno State, and San Diego State. Clearly you're looking at that and saying this should be USC's to dominate for the foreseeable future, but USC kind of has a history of not fulfilling that promise all the time. Then Pod 2, Oregon, Oregon State, Washington, Washington State. Geography, rivalries. That one was pretty easy. Pod 3, Utah, BYU, Colorado, and Colorado State. Gotta get BYU and Utah guaranteed to play every season, and then the up-and-comers from Colorado are gonna always make things a little fascinating. And then Pod 4 has Arizona, Arizona State, Boise State, and UNLV. Boise State and UNLV, are they gonna be able to live up to the hype and equate themselves as actual Pac-12 contenders? Time will tell. And this is what the Season 1 rotation is going to look like, and I think of this group as kind of similar to the Big 12, where the games are going to be entertaining and the conference isn't as deep, but we're still going to get games like USC and Utah. Sign me up. Oregon and Arizona, I think we're going to win that game in Season 1, but Arizona's always been a little bit tricky for them, and I think all eyes are still going to be on Colorado. Their protected rival this go-around is going to be Oregon State, and we'll see how that goes. And here's what the Season 2 rotation will look like. Again, same kind of ideas. Taking a look at what some of these protected rivals are going to be. These are big games, and games that I'm still going to be excited about seeing, and the top-end talent I think is going to be there, but it's going to be more about seeing what teams from the bottom actually rise up in this conference and make some of these games that may not seem right now to be as interesting to be those big tune-in games that we're going to want to see how they play out during the season. And our final rotation is here in Season 3, where you can take a look at some of these games, and I think the ones we'd have circled here right off the bat is USC and Washington and UCLA and Colorado, but let's all keep in mind this is a couple of seasons away and the trajectory could totally change, and God forbid UNLV and Oregon State is a game that's going to decide the fate of the Pac-12. Crazier things have happened. Now that we've gone through all those power conferences, let's take a look at some of the other conferences that are still going to be competing for a chance to eventually make it into the power conferences. And here's your first look at the American, which is a nice hodgepodge of former Conference USA and American schools, and some Sun Belt even mixed in there a little bit, I think. So I think this is going to be a scrappy group and may actually be the first one that produces a team that does make its way up to one of the power conferences from one of the lower levels. Here's our look at what the MAC looks like, and the MAC is the same as it always is, but take a great look at consistency. It's always a nice reminder of no matter what happens in the college football landscape, the MAC shall survive. And this is what our Sun Belt conference is going to look like. Some same teams, some new teams. Again, I think this is just going to be some good football that I don't know if any of these teams really has true aspirations of immediately making their way up to the super conference football, as conceited as that sounds, but I do think there will be some games that occasionally happen in this conference where we're going to want to check in and see how things are going. And now, a lot of those power teams that did not make it into a super conference, you've now found their landing spot. I've taken some schools with some Northeast or pseudo-Ivy ties and decided to put them all together into one football conference that kind of resembles the Big East, but I think it's going to give a good chance for some of these teams that have lost that status as a power football program to go in here and prove themselves and win a pretty competitive league that should produce some football that's worth at least keeping half an eye on. And honestly, this is where it's going to get a little dark. This is our brand new Conference USA squad. Yeah, it's only 4 members, but they're going to try, and if they do well, they're probably not going to be able to make it straight to a power conference, but they could at least move into one of the more expansive leagues and prove themselves there, so the teams from this spot forward are going to have a little more work to do. And this is the new Mountain West Conference. That is all that I have to say that is nice about the Mountain. I take that back. They have Hawaii. That is nice about the Mountain West Conference. And our final conference, the Independent Conference. It has Air Force. Air Force plays solid football on occasion. So Air Force will be a team to be reckoned with, and they're really going to stay in the spot until another team makes more sense to be independent. And we'll let that flow as it needs to, that there really isn't a difference between them or Hawaii being in this spot and the other one being in the Mountain West, quite honestly. They're both, like we've mentioned, going to have to do a whole lot of work to make their way up the college football food chain, so we'll let Air Force and be a service academy and let them be independent for this time forward. Now that we've gotten through all the minutiae of conference realignment, let's talk rosters. We are going to be using the 2023 rosters for this upcoming season. And there's going to be no perfect roster set at this point in time, but I think these are going to do a good job of at least getting us off to a good start and seeing where it goes from here. And on the topic of rosters, recruiting is going to be a little different in year 1 than it's going to be for the seasons following this. I've included as many real 2024 prospects as I could, but obviously still probably missed some pretty big time ones. I adjusted all of their school choices to accurately reflect what recruiting status is as of now, and as you know, with 16, 17, 18-year-olds, that can change at a moment's notice, and some of this may be outdated. What it didn't do was automatically commit kids to any school right off the bat. I still wanted teams to have to put those kids on the board and offer a scholarship to actually land them. This won't be perfect, and not everyone is going to end up at the correct school when all is said and done. After this season, though, we'll use Fang's recruiting overhaul from the college football revamped community and see the prospects that it generates, and it will lead to a part of the Dynasty that we can be a little more invested in. But for season 1, I'll probably check in periodically and see what players we got that Florida State is already involved with or has commits from, and catch everyone up on the prospects to get to know going into season 2, and then we'll see how the landscape is looking for some other schools as well. Then let's look at our roster as Florida State here. So we have our Heisman hopeful quarterback in Jordan Travis, who a lot of our season is going to depend on him staying healthy. And hopefully the guys behind him don't come into play, but if they do, there's Tate Rodemaker and AJ Duffy, who are similarly rated, and they're going to be probably the 2 favorites heading in to season 2 for grabbing a starting quarterback spot. And then our true freshman who will end up redshirting is going to be Brock Glenn, and it'll take a couple of years for him to develop and be into a playable category, but something to still monitor as we go through the season. Here's what our running back room is going to look like. We're going to be led by Trey Benson, who's going to hopefully get a lot of carries, but I'm still going to be trying to find ways to get Lawrence Toafili, who has a little bit of a speedier skill set. Keziah Holmes, who's a big back, maybe get him into some short yardage and under center formations. Rodney Hill has got a lot of juice on him that I want to get all 4 of those guys some looks, and that leaves Sam Singleton, who's a true freshman there, that he is going to be redshirted, that there really isn't a role for him this year, and then maybe going into season 2, he shows something there that we want to take a look at and give him a kind of similar role to Rodney Hill will have this year. Then we have our wide receiver group here, who we're going to be led by Johnny Wilson and Keon Coleman, who are going to be taking a lot of the big-time snaps for us. Not just because they're big receivers, but they have the most polished skill sets, and they have the highest ratings here, and we're going to try and play into that and get them the ball when we can. And the third wide receiver role is going to be the one that's really up for grabs here. I feel like it's going to be a situation where one game they're going to have 5 catches, and really be a part of the offense, and then the next game they may not get a whole lot of targets. So I think everybody in this group has a chance to contribute, and the only one we're going to make a change with is Vendravius Jacobs. He'll be redshirting this year, and I have a lot of hopes for him in the future, but there's just such a crowded room right now with a lot of guys who are going into second and third seasons that I'd rather go and give him some time to develop and let him have more of a role later on in his career. That brings us over to our tight ends, where we've brought in the South Carolina transfer, Jaheim Bell. I really want to move him around the field as much as possible and get him the ball in a lot of different circumstances and maybe even getting carries. And someone else to keep an eye on is going to be Kyle Morlock. He's a transfer from Shorter College. He is a huge body, and he is going to come into handy in, I think, a lot of goal line situations, and he can move for how big he is as well, so keep an eye out for him during the season. I think he's going to have some pretty interesting moments that could have a big impact on whether or not we get to fulfill our ultimate goals. And not a whole lot going on the offensive line, just redshirting some of the young depth that we have, but this is going to be a group that is a lot of guys who are in the mid-80s that are going to be able to contribute early on and do what they're supposed to do, and then we'll kind of see how things develop from that point forward. But I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of drama with this group. I feel like it's going to hold up pretty solidly. May not be a strength of our team, but it's definitely going to be something that doesn't hold us back, and we're just going to need to keep an eye on, though, for future seasons. We're going to need to start developing some quantity and quality of young depth, because there is either going to be a time this coming off season or the one after it where we're going to lose a lot of these dudes, and we're going to need some step up from some of the young guys. And then the defensive ends are going to be business as usual, really. We have Patrick Payton, who's going to be a big-time performer and was the ACC Defensive Rookie of the Year last year. And then we have, on the other side, Jared Verse, who is a big-time NFL prospect who could go top 10 in the draft. And there's some other depth that you'll see on the field that we're going to try and get into some pass rush situations, but nothing really to make a remark on right now. You know, those guys will have to step up to make a name for themselves. And then defensive tackle is a group that we have a lot of depth between. Fabian Lovett, Braden Fisk, and Daryl Jackson are going to be huge performers, and then there is some real young dude standouts that could happen in a Josh Farmer or Daniel Lyons. And then Ayo Tafase is a huge body there that I think is still going to get some snaps on the field, and it doesn't leave a lot of room for a guy like Keith Sampson, so I wouldn't expect him to make any impact, and that's why he'll be redshirted for this year. Most times we're only going to be playing two linebackers, and you're going to see us use our majority of time Kalen DeLoach and Tatum Bethune as those two primary linebackers, and they're going to get to clean up a lot of the work there, and occasionally you'll see a guy like DJ Lundy in there, but the only other person I want to point out here that it could get some snaps, and maybe even some snaps that are huge for us, is Blake Nicholson, who's a very talented freshman. He's very fast, very athletic, so I could see in some pass rush situations where you'll want to keep an eye on when number 30 is on the field and see if he's going to make an impact for us early, or if this is just more of a developmental year, but not going to redshirt him because I want him to get those snaps, and I think he's too talented to not play at all in his true freshman season. That brings us to our defensive backs, who at corner, we're going to have a pretty good group that is going to be led by Fentrell Cypress, the highly touted transfer from Virginia. Renardo Green and Jerian Jones are going to be getting a majority of our snaps, but still trying to work in sophomore Azarie Thomas, who has a lot of talent. And then the rest are really depth guys that I don't think are going to factor in a ton. Quindarius Jones, I like his skill set, but he's going to be another redshirt guy that just doesn't have a role on this team as of now. And then that brings us to our safeties, who we have Shaheem Brown, who will be one of our starters, and then Akeem Dent, who's been with the program for quite a while, is also going to get his run as a starter. But somebody that I want you to keep an eye on is a true freshman safety in Conrad Hussey. He has a lot of skills, and he comes from St. Thomas Aquinas, where they produce guys at such a high rate that I would not be surprised if he has the goods to be able to make an impact early for us. So that's going to be our Florida State Seminoles for 2023, and I'm excited to see who's going to step up for us. Now let's look at our schedule. Let's see what Season 1 is going to hold in store for us. And so, I think I've seen some things that I am not a huge fan of. So we're going to open up the season with Oklahoma State, which I feel like is a pretty good test for us, especially considering in Week 2, our first ever SEC game is going to be against Alabama at Alabama. So, all those things I talked about games mattering and really getting some big time games on the schedule, has come to fruition. And now we have them, and then LSU. It's a home game there. So nice. We get a bye week after that. That's just lovely. And then we get to come back off of that and play Boston College at Boston College, which I feel I like the little ACC connection there. Then we play Charlotte at home, which will be good to get back into a groove of things. I feel like that could be very difficult after that stretch. And then we have an open date before we go on the road and do a South Carolina and Clemson road trip together. Oh boy, this new SEC has something else. And then we get a home game against Miami and Georgia Tech, so no qualms with that. At UCF, so not a long road trip for that one. Home game against Georgia before going at Florida, and then the SEC title game. So I really think we have gotten what we have asked for with this conference. And if anybody has ever played NCAA 14, you know you can't adjust the conference games and the order that they come in. So that is a completely organic result that has happened for us there. I like the schedule. Game 1 against Oklahoma State is a program that has always been competitive, and last year they had a little bit of a dip where things were not great for them, we'll say. But we'll take a look at their roster before week 1 and kind of get acquainted with what that challenge is going to be. But I think any team is going to be a good warm-up and help you get into the groove of things before going at Alabama in week 2 is going to be insane. That's a SEC schedule that's going to test us in every form and facet there. So I'm a little scared, but also a little excited. I'm always looking for the best sliders and gameplay modifications to try and keep things interesting on a 10-year-old game. We'll be using the progression and declaration tools to help make those realistic as possible, so we're not having to use base NCAA 14 progression and then actually having some underclassmen declaring with those tools. And then the one that I'm most excited to use is the transfer portal tool that's been put out there and has been tested pretty well, so we'll see how that plays out into our Dynasty and getting to add that to our universe. The next video that comes out will be week 1 against Oklahoma State. Then shortly after that, I'll be doing a week 1 recap video that catches you up on the national action from week 1, including some gameplay footage from some other games. Thank you so much for starting this journey with me. I can't wait to see where this ends up, and go Noles!